Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Brett Talley Daniel, MD, a neurologist and headache doctor. Today I'm podcasting on, is alcohol a migraine trigger? Well, migraine is present in 12% of the world's population, and in women, 3 times more than men. In one study, 25% of women had migraine at age 42, and 6% of men had migraine at age 38, after which the incidence of migraine decreased. But migraine is the most common chronic medical problem for women. For women, migraine is more common than diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, or arthritis. Migraine headaches are frequently one-sided, associated with moderate or severe throbbing, headache pain, nausea, vomiting, and sensitivity to light and sound. Migraines are disabling, with the patient oftentimes missing work or social activities. There are many relationships which are thought to trigger or bring on migraine headache, such as menstruation for women, fasting, or stress. One of the most commonly stated but not quite scientifically documented migraine triggers is drinking alcohol, especially red wine. This article explores the neurology literature on this subject. So, is alcohol a migraine trigger? Alcohol is commonly stated to be a trigger by many patients, and that fact is accepted by many doctors. Controlled studies regarding consumption of alcohol triggering migraine are mostly positive for red wine, but there are confusing results that limit the relationship with other forms of alcohol. Older personal non-scientific statements. Older historical statements are stronger than newer, more carefully constructed scientific research studies. One of the earliest references connecting migraine with alcohol was made by Celcius 25 BC to 50 AD. Quote, "The pain is contracted by drinking wine," period, end quote. Another earlier statement was made by Paul of Aegina, 625 through 690 AD, who commented on the relationship between drinking wine and the occurrence of migraine. Paulus Argentina in the 17th century described migraine from, quote, "drinking of wine," period, end of quote. It's been thought that certain chemicals in alcohol, such as tyramine and histamine, act in the brain to set off a migraine headache. Well, who educates about the triggers? The National Headache Foundation, the American Headache Society, many migraine websites, and doctors who write about migraine advocate attention to alcohol and dietary factors to avoid a migraine, and often provide a list of foods and chemicals that are suspected of doing this. However, the whole question of migraine worsened by various foods is controversial and confusing. What do expert neurologists who write about migraine say? Lance, the famous Australian neurologist who first wrote about ice pick headache, wrote in 1995, quote, "My patients with special food triggers have the same number of migraine attacks when they avoid triggers as before. The only thing on which they agreed is that alcohol precipitates attacks, especially red wines. Otherwise, I think the question of dietary migraine is very suspect." Well, what is a trigger? The American Headache Society webpage states the following, quote, "A migraine trigger is any factor that causes a headache in individuals who are prone to develop headaches. Only a small proportion of migraine sufferers, however, clearly can identify triggers. Examples of triggers include stress, sleep disturbances, fasting, hormones, bright or flickering lights, odors, cigarette smoke, alcohol, aged cheeses, chocolate, monosodium glutamate, nitrates, aspartame, and caffeine. For some women, the decline in the blood level of estrogen during the onset of menstruation is a trigger for migraine headaches. The interval between exposure to a trigger and the onset of headaches varies from hours to 2 days. Exposure to a trigger does not always lead to a headache. Conversely, avoiding of triggers cannot completely prevent headaches. Migraine trigger literature review. Kelman, writing in Cephalgia in 2007 on The triggers are precipitants of acute migraine attack. Listed stress is the frequency of 79% and food at 26.9%. The table of frequency of individual migraine triggers from his articles is stress 79, hormones 65, not eating 57%, weather 53%, sleep disturbance 49%, perfume or odor 43%, neck pain 38%, lights 38%, alcohol 37%, kind of near the bottom, of smoke 35%, and sleeping late 32%. Gallagher, writing in Headache in 1988 on diet and migraine, stated, quote, alcohol is a nonspecific vasodilator that is thought to provoke migraine attacks in susceptible persons by depressing or altering the function of the central vasomotor centers, since the direct effect of alcohol on blood vessels is insignificant. Of all the known precipitating agents, alcohol is the most consistent provoker of headache in the largest number of migraine patients, end quote. That's all from Gallagher. Littlewood et al. Wrote in Lancet in 1988 on red wine as a cause of migraine. They studied 19 migraine patients who thought they were sensitive to red wine, 5 migraineurs who thought they were not sensitive, and 8 control patients who neither had migraine nor red wine sensitivity. The study was for 11 patients sensitive to red wine to drink 300 milligrams of red wine and the rest to drink 300 milligrams of vodka and lemonade. All drinks were taken cold from a brown glass bottle through a dark straw to conceal color and flavor. Both the red wine and vodka mixture had the same alcohol content. 9 of the 11 red wine sensitive patients reported migraine after drinking wine, but none of the 8 patients reported migraine after drinking vodka. The tyramine content of the wine was less than 1 milligram and thought to not be responsible for inducing migraine. The authors concluded that flavonoids, substances that give red wine its color and which are absent in white wine, cause the migraine headaches, and they suggested that studies be done to discover the chemical agents provoking migraine. Diamond, writing in Neurology Forum in 1991 on dietary factors in vascular headaches, stated, quote, many migraine patients will report an acute migraine attack precipitated by consumption of alcoholic beverages, such as red wine, period, end of quote. Jarman et al. Described the release of 14C5-hydroxytryptamine from human platelets by red wine in Life Sciences in 1991. Jarman et al. Stated, quote, since 5-HT is probably released from body stores during migraine attacks, and red wine is known to provoke migraine episodes in susceptible individuals, release of 5-HT possibly from central stores could represent a plausible mechanism for its mode of action, end of quote. Spearings, writing in Headache Quarterly in 1992 on headache caused by medications and chemicals, stated, open quote, alcohol can also precipitate the so-called hangover headache in those who are not subject to headaches. Hangover headache occurs in up to 50% of subjects with an alcohol intake of 1.5 milliliter or more per kilogram body weight. It's generalized in location, often throbbing in nature, and is accentuated by sudden movements of the head, end of quote. Peatfield wrote in Headache in 1995 on relationships between food, wine, and beer-precipitated migrainous headache, end of quote. Peatfield queried 577 consecutive patients attending the Princess Margaret Migraine Clinic from 1989 to 1991 about dietary precipitants of their headaches. Migraine occurred in 429 patients, and 16.5% of these reported headaches brought on by cheese or chocolate, and nearly always both. Of the migraineurs, 18% reported sensitivity to all alcoholic drinks, while another 11% were sensitive to red but not white wine. Beer produced a migraine in 28% of the patients. There was a definite statistical association between sensitivity to cheese or chocolate and to red wine. The p-value was less than 0.001. And also to beer, p-value less than 0.001. None of the 40 patients with tension-type headaches reported sensitivity to foods, and only one was sensitive to alcoholic drinks. At the end of the article, Pete Field stated, quote, "It is concluded that cheese, chocolate, and red wine sensitivity in particular have closely related mechanisms in some way related more to migraine than to more chronic tension-type headache, while quite separate mechanisms play a major role in sensitivity to alcoholic drinks in general." Konayeska et al., writing in 2000 in a Przegilek, it's spelled Przegilek, it's a Russian journal, quote, "On red wine in medicine, panacea, fashion, or risk factor," tried to put the red wine issue in perspective and acknowledged that red wine had been the subject of much interest in healthcare professionals representing different specialists of medicine. In general, the cardioprotective mechanisms of red wine, although not completely understood, are thought to relate to ethanol, which increases high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, HDL, and inhibits platelets aggregation. Red wine also contains polyphenols, which are flavonoids, phenolic acids, and stilbenes, which have antioxidant, vasorelaxing, and antiplatelet properties. Konayeska et al. Point out that there is a considerable body of evidence indicating that regular consumption of red wine at moderate doses, which is 200 to 400 milligrams a day, provides protection against ischemic heart disease, perhaps diabetes, osteoporosis, and some cancers. The authors then stress the dangers of alcohol intake, dependence, alcoholism, organic disease, migraine, and allergies, and advise that, quote, "medical recommendations of red wine consumption be formulated very carefully," end of quote. One has to balance the good medicine effects of red wine with the bad to get a clear picture. Celcius takes a similar global view of the place of red wine in health in an article entitled "Alcohol and Migraine, Trigger Factor Consumption Mechanisms, a Review," written in 2008 in the Journal of Headache Pain. This study utilized a Medline search from 1988 to October 2007 for headache and alcohol, headache and wine, headache, migraine and alcohol, and migraine and wine. In retrospective studies, about 1 out of 3 migraine patients reported alcohol as a frequent migraine trigger, but only 10% of migraine patients reported alcohol as a frequent migraine trigger. Recent studies showed that migraine patients consume less alcohol than controls. Red wine was reported to be the principal trigger of migraine, but other studies showed that white wine or other drinks were more frequently involved. The study reported that different chemicals thought to be responsible for migraine. There was uncertainty and agreement of which chemicals were important, yet biogenic amines, sulfites, flavonoid, phenols, 5-hydroxytryptamine, and vasodilating effects were discussed. The author concluded with the following statement, quote, "The fact that few headache patients cannot tolerate some alcoholic drinks does not justify the consideration that alcohol is a major trigger and the suggestion of abstinence. In fact, low doses of alcohol can have a beneficial effect on patients, such as migraineurs, who are reported to have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease." Pancosi quoted stating that, quote, "alcohol induced migraine in a very individual, specific reaction," end of quote. Pancosi et al. Wrote another article on alcohol and migraine as a legacy contribution from the American Headache Society Committee for Headache Education and the Fred Sheftal MD Education Center. And they stated, number one, alcohol is a migraine trigger, but its risk is overstated. 2. Alcohol can provoke two types of headaches in migraine patients: an attack within a few hours and a delayed hangover headache. 3. Migraine patients consume alcohol less often than the general public. Number 4. Although migraine sufferers generally consider red wine the simple migraine trigger, studies show that other alcoholic drinks are equally more frequently the cause. Number 5. Alcohol and not a different constituent of the drink is probably the trigger. And number 6. A small dose of alcohol, such as a 5-ounce glass of good wine, can be consumed if it does not trigger migraine frequently. Drink in small amounts to the benefit of your heart, but use caution with breast cancer risks. Pancosi et al. Ask, how important is alcohol as a trigger of migraine? Migraine patients consider many foods capable of triggering migraines. The food-trigger relationship is frequently equivocal. In fact, lists of migraine triggers inducing migraine to equate their migraine attack with a food just consumed. This is similar to crediting a new symptom to a drug they're taking at that moment. With full review, the cause and effect may or may not be true. A food may be likely considered a trigger of migraine if A, a strict time relationship exists between the consumption and the start of headache, or B, that this link is not occasional. From retrospective patient reports, it's very difficult to make sure that a link exists. In fact, especially in the new drug symptoms example, a possible link to other frequent triggers, stress, post-stress, fear, anxiety, menstruation, weather changes, etc., must be considered. When chocolate was studied to assess a chocolate trigger headache link, no connection was found with migraine and tension-type headache. Many consider alcohol to be a sure migraine trigger, but its importance is still debated. In studies from different countries that collect data from the past, about 1/3 of migraine sufferers reported alcohol as a migraine trigger, at least occasionally. In these retrospective studies, only 10% reported a frequent link with alcohol. Curiously, in some countries, the connection was negligible, that is, 1.4 to 6.1% of patients. The degree of alcohol habits perhaps explains these differences. No sex difference exists in alcohol susceptibility. The great majority of studies show no differences between migraine with or without aura. No difference exists between migraine and tension-type headaches. Cluster headache patients have higher alcohol sensitivity, which is about 50 to 80%. In a forward-looking study, PAMINA, published in 2007, Austrian researchers examined a large number of factors related to migraine. After an advanced data analysis, they found limited importance of nutrition, including alcoholic beverages, in the precipitation of migraine. This work considered alcohol and other nutritional factors taken the day before onset of headache. What is the interval from alcohol consumption to the start of headache? Alcohol can trigger a migraine attack within a few hours, that is 30 minutes to 3 hours. This is the typical headache induced by alcohol. Another type is the delayed alcohol-induced headache. The hangover headache appears the next morning after alcohol intake. At this time, the blood alcohol level is falling and reaches zero. The symptom of headache is present in 2/3 of subjects with alcohol hangover. This alcohol headache hangover can be experienced by anyone, but people with migraine are more susceptible. Furthermore, migraine patients can develop headache with the ingestion of moderate amounts of alcohol. All alcoholic drinks can provoke either immediate or delayed headache. Alcohol consumption in migraine. Since alcohol can trigger a migraine attack, in a sense, only a small number of migraineurs should drink alcohol. Population-based studies performed in various countries, the United States, Scandinavia, Netherlands, Japan, Italy, show that fewer migraine sufferers consume alcohol than those without headaches. Moreover, the more alcohol consumed the less likely the drinker reported migraine and non-migraine headache. This fact may be explained by sufferers of headache giving up alcohol since it's a trigger factor for their headache attacks. However, an Italian study seems not to support this explanation. In this study, only a very small percentage of non-alcohol consuming female migraineurs reported that alcohol drinks were a trigger. They concluded that this fact could not explain the large difference in alcohol consumption between migraine and the general public. Is alcohol or another component of the drink the headache trigger? Red wine is typically considered the most likely alcoholic drink trigger. In 1988, Littlewood and colleagues showed that 300 milliliters or 10 ounces of red wine, but not vodka, with equivalent alcohol content provoked headache in red wine sensitive migraineurs. Migraineurs not sensitive to wine and non-headache controls did not have headaches triggered. They suggested that red wine contains a migraine-provoking agent that is not alcohol. Some studies in France and Italy report white wine as a major culprit. However, there are reports of also spirits, sparkling wine, and beer triggering headache. Wine does not need to be ingested in large quantities to produce headache. In wine-sensitive patients, the time between drinking red wine and developing headache varies from 30 minutes to 3 hours. Only 1 or 2 glasses at most need to be ingested. The fundamental question still remains to be made definitely clear. Is alcohol or another component of the drink responsible for triggering headache? It remains difficult to answer the question. To provoke a migraine attack, a combination of factors may be necessary. These may include a given blood-brain alcohol level with degree of brain sensitivity among the presence or if not other triggers. Perhaps this combination activates the pathways necessary for headache to become active. Otherwise, if alcohol is not directly involved in producing headache per se, a substance present in the different alcoholic drinks seems responsible or facilitates the alcohol effect. Some components of alcoholic beverages, such as tyramine, phenyltyramine, histamine, sulfites, flavonoid-phenols, have been considered possible triggers for migraine. This is due to their presence in various alcoholic drinks and the belief the drink is capable of triggering migraine. However, this is not verified, as studies are either negative or lack adequate proof to support their causal role. Histamine is the subject most frequently mentioned. Some consider it an indicator of the wholesomeness of the food or food quality. Various foods such as fish, aged cheese, meat such as sausage, salami, vegetables such as eggplant, sauerkraut, and spinach contain much higher amounts of histamine than alcoholic drinks. In addition, many foods, including alcohol, may release histamine from bodily sources such as mast cells. Histamine infused by vein is a time-tested way to provoke a migraine headache. However, other than headache, many symptoms of the so-called histamine intolerance are not characteristic of a migraine attack. That antihistamine drugs do not prevent red wine headache further fails to support histamine as a critical trigger. The same observations on histamine are valid for sulfites. Much higher amounts are found in many foods compared to wine. These include dried fruits, chips, raisins, soy sauce, pickles, and juice fruits. So-called sulfite sensitivity provokes asthmatic responses rather than headache. Tyramine is a naturally occurring monoamine that's not able to cross the blood-brain barrier. It's responsible for the so-called cheese effect. Its triggering relationship to migraine has been most extensively studied. The studies have generally shown negative results. Consider tyramine is found in most meats and fermented foods, many condiments, such as figs, red plums, and raspberries, among others. Tyramine is nearly impossible to avoid as it is so widely distributed in foods. In addition, the tyramine content of wine is negligible. In comparison with the tyramine doses utilized in oral challenge studies, flavonoid phenols, and tannins, both alike in character and action, are byproducts of alcohol fermentation. These congeners are alike minor chemical substances give wine its distinctive character. Other known congeners include acetone, acetaldehyde, fuel oil, and furila. These alcohol byproducts have been suggested as responsible for triggering migraine. Darker colored drinks such as whiskey, brandy, and red wine have more of these products than lighter drinks such as vodka, gin, or white wine. However, certain studies on white wine and spirits suggested more frequent involvement than with darker drinks. Bourbon has 37 times more times of these substances than vodka. Recently, it was shown to cause a worse hangover than vodka, increasing the intensity of the hangover effect. Bourbon did not appear to increase the risk for impaired performance, such as sleep-disrupting effect, and so on. The lack of a role for congeners in alcohol hangover was recently confirmed in an animal model of migraine. Alcohol is probably the trigger of migraine. Increased artery size is the mechanism frequently suggested. This vasodilatation could explain the immediate headache produced and provoked by high initial blood-brain levels. Vasodilatation cannot explain delayed alcohol-induced headache, as the symptom of alcohol hangover appears when alcohol levels decline to reach zero. If vasodilatation is not responsible for alcohol-related headache, what other explanations might explain this effect? Perhaps an action on neurotransmitters involved in central pain control is responsible. Specifically, serotonin release must be considered. Population surveys show that illicit recreational drugs such as ecstasy, amphetamine derivative, and party pill, which is a piperazine derivative, both serotonin and 5-HT releasing drugs provoke headache in a high percentage of users. Young adults use recreational drugs very commonly in combination with alcohol, and 90% overlap there. Controlled studies show that certain drugs produce migraine in 2 out of 3 subjects. Another piperazine derivative, MCPP, is a non-selective serotonin activator. It is a liver-produced byproduct of trazodone, an often used sleeping aid. MCPP is extensively used to study altered serotonin nerve transmission and provokes migraine-like headache. This occurs in about 50% of subjects with oral MCPP. Migraine-like headaches and many additional symptoms occur when given IM MCPP in research. Should migraine patients avoid alcohol consumption? Alcohol in low dose, especially of red wine, reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. Migraine, specifically with R, or high frequency, increases the risk of some cardiovascular diseases. The unselective suggestion of alcohol abstinence for all migraine patients is not correct. In fact, patients with high migraine frequency with increased risk of ischemic stroke may benefit from a low dose of alcohol. Certainly, alcoholic drinks may trigger migraine and tension headaches in some patients. This is probably much less likely than suggested by patients' recall. However, it is frequently necessary to consume alcohol along with other factors, such as anxiety, stress events, emotions, etc., to trigger a headache attack. Before alcohol is considered responsible for a migraine attack, the patient should review certain factors. These include careful recording of the intake and the amount of alcohol, the specific drink types, the frequency of induced headache, to the amount and type, and the 48 hours prior to the headache, and any situation or stress prior to the alcohol intake. Penconozzi et al. Closed with this statement, quote, "If you find consistent agreement among these factors in the headache, alcohol is probably causing headaches. However, when the factors do not associate together consistently or extremely rarely, abstinence is not necessary. Since alcohol is considered a risk factor for breast cancer, know your risk for this disease." Kiminchowski, AF et al., writing in Headache in 2014 on wine and headache, performed a midline search with the terms headache, migraine, and wine. The writers commented that, quote, "The notion of migraine attacks triggered by food and beverages had been positive for centuries. Red wine in particular has been acknowledged as a migraine trigger since antiquity, when Celcius described headache pain after drinking wine. Since then, references to the relationship between alcohol ingestion and headache attacks are numerous. The most common initiator of these attacks among alcoholic beverages is clearly wine. The aim of this review is to present and discuss the available literature on wine and headache. The authors commented that full papers specifically on headache and wine are scarce. General literature related to medicine and wine is available, but scientific rigor is typically lacking. The few studies on wine and headache were mostly presented as abstracts, despite the common knowledge in patients' complaints about wine ingestion and headache attacks. These studies suggest that red wine, but not white and sparkling wines, do trigger headache and migraine attacks independently of dosage in less than 30% of the subjects. Kinchentowski et al. Closed by saying, wine, and specifically red wine, is a migraine trigger. Non-migraineurs may have headache attacks with wine ingestion as well. The reasons for that triggering potential are uncertain, but the presence of phenolic flavonoid radicals and the potential for interfering with the central serotonin metabolism are probably the underlying mechanism of the relationship between wine and headache. Further controlled studies are necessary to enlighten this rational traditional belief. Bokum wrote in Headache in 2016 on migraine triggers and oxidative stress, a narrative review and synthesis. The authors mentioned that, open quote, the recent discovery that the TRPA ion channel transduces oxidative stress and triggers neurogenic inflammation suggests that oxidative stress may be the common denominator underlying migraine triggers. End of quote. Borkham performed a Medline search for crossing the terms oxidative stress and brain with alcohol, dehydration, water deprivation, monosodium glutamate, aspartame, tyramine, phenylethylamine, dietary nitrates, nitrosamines, noise, weather, air pollutants, hypoglycemia, hypoxia, infection, estrogen, circadian, sleep deprivation, information processing, psychological stress, or nitrogen intolerance. Flavonoids was crossed with pro-oxidant. The relationship list of the resulting articles was examined for further relevant studies. The focus was on empirical studies, in vitro and of animals, of individual triggers, indicating whether by and what mechanism they can generate oxidative stress. Borkham concluded by saying, open quote, oxidative stress is a plausible underlying principle behind the types of migraine triggers encountered in clinical practice. The possible implications for prevention and for understanding the nature of the migraine attack are discussed. End of quote. Underwater et al. Writing in 2018 on alcoholic beverages as trigger factor and the effect on alcohol consumption behavior in patients with migraine. In the European Journal of Neurology stated that, quote, our study shows the effect that this trigger, that is alcoholic beverages, has on patients with over 25% of patients with migraine not consuming alcohol because of the presumed triggering effect, end quote. The study was done in Dutch adults aged 18 to 80 years of age with migraines with or without aura. Of the 2,197 individuals in the study, 35% reported alcohol as a trigger. As a result, just over 25% of the participants reported abstaining from alcohol consumption. This was a web-based questionnaire study from individuals who participated in the Leiden University of Migraine Neuroanalysis study. It's a study of Dutch adults with migraine with or without aura, recruited by advertisement, public announcement, or website. The questionnaire asked about number of alcoholic beverages consumed, triggers for migraine, reasons for abstinence, and time from alcohol consumption to migraine onset. Among 2,197 respondents, 70% reported drinking alcoholic beverages in the past 3 months. Among those who did not drink alcoholic beverages, about 25% had stopped drinking because of their presumed potential to trigger migraines. A large majority of respondents, 77%, considered wine, especially red wine, to be the most common alcoholic trigger for migraine. Only 8% of participants reported that drinking wine consistently lead to an attack. Among those who did not drink alcoholic beverages, about 25% had stopped drinking because of the presumed potential to trigger migraines. A large majority of respondents, 77%, considered wine, especially red wine, to be the most common alcoholic trigger for migraine. Yet only 8% of participants reported that drinking wine consistently led to an attack. This inconsistency between drinking wine and migraine attacks suggested that alcohol alone may not be enough to trigger attacks, according to the authors. Instead, individual variation in trigger threshold may play a role. They suggested 1/3 of participants had a quick onset of attack within 3 hours of having a drink. Alcohol may have a quick onset of attack or a slow onset, such as with hangover headaches, which usually develop several hours later or the next day as the blood ethanol levels decreases over time. The shorter onset suggests a different mechanism, alcohol-triggered migraine, and that substances other than ethanol may be involved, they hypothesized. So Underwater et al. In summary, they said, over 25% of migraineurs who abstain from alcohol do so because of the presumed potential to trigger attacks. Among alcoholic drinks, red wine was reported as the most common trigger for attacks. Alcohol was inconsistently linked to attacks, suggesting individual variation in alcohol-triggered migraine threshold. Onset of attack was quick, within 3 hours of a drink. Different studies report different findings of which type of migraine triggers migraine the worst. One European study found that 11% of migraineurs thought that red wine was their most common trigger, yet a French study said that 54% of alcohol-induced attacks came after drinking white wine. Red wine has a 20 to 200 times more histamine than white wine. Women have migraines triggered by red wine more than men. So related questions regarding all this. So, is alcohol really a migraine trigger? Migraine is an inherited genetic medical problem. The genes for migraine, with or without aura, have been found, and the data about this is published. You're born with migraine, and you're going to die with it, unless scientists learn how to change your genes. The exact relationship for and if alcohol aggravates migraine isn't clear. Currently, migraine experts believe alcohol may cause a change in brain activity, which affects neurochemical and neuronal transmission. What about alcohol and cluster headache? The diagnostic classification of headache disorders, number 3, refers to cluster headaches, one of the trigeminal autonomic neuralgias. The first classification of migraine used in the U.S. in the 80s considered cluster headache to be a type of migraine, but today the two conditions are seen separately, but with some similar features. For instance, cluster headache, like migraine, responds to fast-acting sumatriptan 6 milligram subcutaneously, which acts in 10 minutes. However, it's known that when a cluster headache patient consumes alcohol during their cluster headache times, 1 to 7 headache days a week for 6 weeks, alcohol will then trigger a cluster headache. This relationship is only true during their cluster time, and they can drink at other times without fear of a cluster headache if they're not currently having headaches. What about migraine triggers? Are they real? Many triggers are thought to trigger an attack of episodic migraine. Mamura, MG, writing in Current Pain Headache Reports 2018, stated that although the experimental trigger glycerol tonight probably produces migraine, natural triggers are much less predictable and vary in importance between individuals. Many migraine triggers have been established based on patient surveys, dietary studies, and clinical trials. The reliable, well-known triggers are stress, menstrual cycle change, weather changes, sleep disturbance, alcohol and certain foods. Also, fasting, premenstrual periods in women, let down after stress, and most likely low barometric pressure changes are migraine triggers. Migraine may have early prodrome before the headache symptoms, such as neck pain, fatigue, sensitivity to light, sounds, and odors. Multiple studies clearly demonstrate triggers in episodic migraine, often related to change in homeostasis or environment. Many common migraine triggers are not easily modifiable, and avoiding triggers may not be realistic. Healthy lifestyle choices such as exercise, adequate sleep, stress management, and eating regularly may prevent triggers and transformation to chronic migraine over time. Number 4, is there a difference between migraine trigger and an aggravation? The International Classification of Headache Disorders separates a migraine trigger from a migraine aggravation by time, usually 48 hours. I quote from my book called Migraine, quote, "Since antiquity, it has been recognized that the brain of a patient with migraine is overly sensitive to different environmental, physical, and emotional factors, and that an attack of migraine may follow the episodic or the continual occurrence of any one of these factors. These provocative events are called either trigger factors if they increase the probability of migraine attack in the short term, usually 48 hours, or aggravating factors if they are associated with a relatively long-term increase in severity or frequency of attacks, usually weeks to months. ICD-8 gives examples of aggravating factors as psychological, psychosocial factors, frequent intake of beverages, alcoholic beverages, other environmental factors. Regarding trigger factors, ICD-8 states, though some trigger factors have been reasonably well studied epidemiologically, that is, menstruation, or in clinical trials like chocolate and aspartame, causal attribution in individual patients may be difficult. Can alcohol provoke two kinds of headache with migraine? Alcohol can trigger a migraine in a headache if it comes within 10 minutes after drinking alcohol. This immediate response is usually only found in persons with migraine. Alcohol can commonly cause a later occurring headache called a hangover headache in a non-migrainer, especially if they drink a lot and the headache comes after a delayed period of time, after sleep the next morning. Persons with migraine may be more sensitive to hangovers than the ordinary person. So this is the end of my dictation on Is Alcohol a Migraine Trigger? Please click subscribe down there so we can follow each other. Look at me on Podbean for other podcasts about migraine. God bless all you people with migraine, and I will see you on the next talk.